You and I both know that working with teens involves a whole new set of questions. Like, they start asking questions that are harder, and they start asking questions that have greater influence and impact because their decisions have greater influence and impact. All of a sudden, they start having new doubts, they have new freedoms, they have new wants, they have new desires, and they're starting to develop a foundation upon which they're going to begin to make all of their decisions. And when they do, they start asking questions. And questions have like a source and a reason why, and good leaders start to dive in and say, why are you asking this question? And one of the ways we can do that is, instead of just answering the questions students ask, we can redirect them by asking a question back. Jesus was notorious for asking questions that led into conversations or led his followers into somewhere. One time Jesus asked a group of disciples, he said, who do other people say that I am? And then instead of then telling them who he was, he then asked them, who do you say that I am? One of the powerful tools that we can have in the life of a student is to be a question asker, to be someone who, when they ask questions, we redirect them with another question. And I have 5 questions that I hear all the time. They're working with students, they're always asking these questions, and sometimes they flat out ask it, and sometimes it's implied in the question that this is the central question they're asking you. Most obviously, and sometimes comes up just simply, hey, is this thing I'm about to do, or is it legal? Like, can you do this? And laws are a decent thing to know. I mean, they'll keep you out of jail, but they're not necessarily a great way to run someone's life. They're not the primary motivator we're trying to get a student to have as a director for what they're doing. If you think about it, I recently drove from California to Montana through the summer towing a trailer. I was on a family camping trip, and depending on what state I was in, I could tow that trailer at a different speed. So in California, it was 55. In Montana, it was like 105. I mean, really, it didn't really depend. It just depended on what state I was in. Same vehicle, same trailer, different rules. I was telling somebody about this, and they were explaining the different laws that they were aware of. Like weed is now just became legal in like 3 more states, so you can smoke it a lot more often, evidently, and it's fine, just depending on what state you're in. I was using prostitution as an example, and one lady corrected me and told me that it's not legal in all of Nevada, only certain counties. Who knew? So I mean, I guess if you're, depending on what county you're in, all of a sudden you're fine. 2 consenting adults exchanging money are good, so long as you're in the right county. What a ridiculous idea. So much of the New Testament was written by the Apostle Paul from jail because it was illegal. And age-based laws only buy us a little bit of time. Like, oh, you don't have to deal with that. It's illegal. You can't drink until you're 21. As if once you're 21, that just opens up everything and it doesn't matter. I'm not saying that it's wrong to drink or, any other activity. I'm just simply saying that laws aren't our primary motivator. They're not the thing we're trying to get students to really do. Instead, we might be asking them this: do you think it's godly? Is it legal is a decent question, but instead of answering what the law says, when you say, well, regardless of what the law says, do you think that's godly? Do you think it's godly to have an abortion? Do you think it's godly to drive at that speed in that way or whatever? And maybe the answer is yes, and maybe the answer is no, but there's a different subject, not what the legislator said or what we voted into law or what somebody has dictated or what one state or country has decided, but instead, do you think it's God-honoring? Another question that surely has come up in your world is, how far is too far? This question always is asked in the context of sexuality, and they want to know where the barriers are. Essentially, it's another rule question. What's legal and what's not? What's God happy with and what's God not? And it just leaves God as sort of this objective legalist in the sky who's determining rules and regulations for their sexuality based on whatever God wants. And God seems really distant, really hard to discern, and way out of the focus for them. And yet, I often direct students back to Genesis 2:25. Genesis 2:25 says that Adam and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. One of the things I think we can say to students is that sexuality is supposed to be and is designed by God to be shame-free. I often tell students, hey, date in the light, it'll help. And that's true both metaphorically and physically. Like, turn on the lights, it'll help. But so will actually doing things and talking through things with friends in the light, like actually bringing people into the story. Here's what we're thinking. And you can ask, like, what do you think? Does that seem right? Even if a student won't share with someone else or with you the express details, I often ask them, instead of asking how far is too far, what about this question? Well, do you think you can thank God for it? Like when you're done with that activity or when you've crossed this line, do you think you go, God, thank you so much. What a gift this date was. And I believe that's what it's supposed to be. Sexuality and dating and all of that is supposed to be a gift from God. And when we use it in a way that honors Him, we can actually thank Him for it. So instead of telling students, hey, how far is too far, and giving your answer, maybe just simply saying, well, do you think you can thank God for that? Like, would you praise Him and say that was a really great choice? Another thing they'll say is, well, what would my friends think? What do my friends think? I mean, what do they say? I had a mentor once who told me that brainstorming, he called it pooling our ignorance. That's a horrible way to view brainstorming. I don't think brainstorming is all, he just obviously hated brainstorming. But he's onto something, that a whole bunch of people believing one thing certainly isn't the best thing. It's not what we would tell students, that the most popular idea is the idea they should do. Well, that's the idea that all my friends think. They agree. If they were writing a paper, their professor probably wouldn't let them use Wikipedia as a source. It's crowdsourced. Now, it might be a really great crowd. It might be a whole bunch of professors with a whole bunch of credentials. But until you know that, just because you found it on the cloud doesn't mean that that's a really great source. And so instead of students, when they're saying, well, what would people think, you then telling them what you think, maybe instead we would say, would godly people agree with your friends? Like in Proverbs 12:15, it says that a fool does whatever's right for him, but godly people listen to advice. Like, are there other people that you could go to? And so when a student says, well, what are my friends? Or they start wrestling with, well, yeah, but my friends are, you can redirect them and say, well, how godly are your friends? Do you think those friends are centering their life on the same thing you're trying to center your life on? And is that thing actually going to take you where you believe God's called you to go? Which leads me to another one, which is, is that really going to happen? Oftentimes, students seem to make their decisions based on whether or not they think the consequence will really take place. Will they really get caught? I mean, I've done a whole bunch of those things and never gotten pulled over. I mean, I've not gotten pregnant yet. I mean, there's a whole variety of things that they decide to do based on whether they think the consequence will really happen to them. There's a whole set of commercials from DirecTV that are really funny on stupid consequences. Like, if there's one, my favorite one is it goes something like this. Like, if your cable's really slow, then you get frustrated. When you get frustrated, you express anger and you throw things. When you throw things, your daughter imitates. When your daughter imitates, she makes bad choices. When she makes bad choices, she ends up with undesirables. When she ends up with undesirables, she ends up tying the knot with an undesirable. When she ties the knot with an undesirable, you end up with a grandson with a dog collar. Don't have a grandson with a dog collar. Now, my apologies if you have a grandson with a dog collar. But nonetheless, it's just this stupid set of circumstances that you're going to go from having like bad DirecTV or bad cable is going to lead to like a kid with a dog collar. But even when students start thinking this way and they start processing, well, it's going to happen, well, it's not necessarily the most valid way to lead somebody's life. Instead, I often ask students, well, do you think that thing will lead you closer to God? Maybe you won't get caught. But in the end, after experiencing it and you didn't get the legalistic consequence you're wondering, did you get closer to God? In John 10:10, it says that the devil comes to seek to kill and destroy. That's his goal, is just to ruin you. And yet Jesus' goal is the abundant life. I think oftentimes students don't want to necessarily know what the godly thing is because they don't believe that God has their best in mind. And yet when we help a student connect with Jesus, we help them connect with the God who has their very best in mind. And so our goal is to help a student get closer to God. And so when they ask that question, they say, well, do you think I'll get caught? The answer is, well, if you did it, do you think it would lead you closer to God? And that'll spark a whole nother conversation. The last one is that just your opinion? And they might actually be onto something. Is that just your opinion? Like, you might just be sharing with them your opinion. In which case, that's not like a valid question for them to say, well, does that really hold much weight? And so this leads us and reminds us that as mentors, what we really want to be doing is directing students back to a source we've mutually submitted ourselves to. And that's this question. Well, is that just your opinion? You say, well, valid, my opinion versus your opinion. But can we find support for what we're talking about in the scriptures? And maybe you agree to disagree because you both have support in the scriptures. But most likely a student hasn't even taken the time to think about it. And if you can spend some time in the scriptures and support why you think what you think and help them to redirect and to wrestle with, now all of a sudden you're wrestling with what God said instead of what I say. So I think sometimes students say, is it legal? And we say, well, do you think it's godly? Sometimes they say, how far is too far? And you say, well, can you thank God for it? Sometimes they'll say, well, what will my friends think? And you say, well, do you think godly people would agree with you? Other times they'll say, well, what is it really going to happen? And you say, well, you think it'll lead you closer to God? And lastly, is that just your opinion? And you say, well, do you think we can find support in the scriptures? I would encourage you as you interact with students not to just answer their questions, but to redirect them with a new question that gets them back to the central truth that we really believe a life centered on Jesus is all about.